Good morning, everyone. The hour of 10 o'clock having arrived, I will convene this hearing of the Science-Based and Technology Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Hearing none, so ordered. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses and our committee members and Ranking Member Fushi for participating in our hearing today. I'd like to begin by requesting unanimous consent that the subcommittee's investigative portfolio be submitted for the record. Hearing none, so ordered. Today's hearing will focus on a proposed regulation by the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council that would require federal contractors to disclose greenhouse gas emissions and set reduction targets. The rule would further require that a London-based company validate those targets. To be clear, today's hearing is not about climate change or whether or not companies should reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, many companies have voluntarily chosen to reduce emissions and are verifying those reductions in a variety of ways already. Instead, today's hearing concerns government overreach and questionable processes that result in the administration picking winners and losers in the marketplace. Regardless of a political affiliation, every member of this institution should be concerned by regulatory policies that usurp Congress's legislative authority. And every member of Congress should be concerned with any regulatory action that arbitrarily selects one company to do business with the federal government without a meritorious selection process. The government should not be in the business of picking winners and losers when it comes to federal contracting. However, unfortunately, that is exactly the case in this instance. This administration published a proposed rule in November which decreed that all major federal contractors will be required to set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and then hire a specified private foreign company to validate those targets. The company anointed by the administration to perform this task is called the Science-Based Target Initiative, or SBTI. According to the information that this committee has gathered, SBTI did not go through a competitive selection process before being chosen for this role. Documents provided by the OMB indicate that representatives from SBTI met with the Council on Environmental Quality to discuss this proposed regulation only twice. There was no other email traffic, no formal vetting or application. It appears SBTI did not even have to submit a single piece of paper explaining why they were the company best suited for this job. The choice of SBTI is not only concerning this committee and the proposed rule, but because of the rule's poor drafting, it raises multiple practical, financial, and national security issues. For instance, ceding the authority to approve the emissions targets of federal contractors to a foreign entity means that we have no way to verify that SBTI's processes are based in sound science. In fact, both Congress and the federal government have very little oversight of the decisions being made here. In addition, companies specializing in oil and gas production may not even have the ability to submit proposals that meet SBTI's science-based targets, which could have a severe impact on our nation's mission readiness in industries such as space and national defense. Our hope is that this hearing will surface these issues and help our members consider these concerns as we move forward. The Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee has investigated this issue since February of this year. It reviewed many documents, sent multiple letters, and met with numerous individuals, including representatives from government agencies and stakeholders, in order to get to this point. The Council has invited Chair Mallory of CEQ and the head of the FAR Council to join us today to answer our remaining questions regarding how this proposed rule came into being, questions only they can answer. Unfortunately, they have declined to be here this morning. Therefore, the witnesses at this hearing are experts who are here to help Congress understand the legal, practical, financial, and national security concerns associated with this proposed regulation. It's my hope that your testimonies today will cover 4 main issue areas. First, the constitutionality of this proposed regulation. Second, the practical impacts that the proposed regulation would have, specifically as it pertains to industry and national security. Third, the issues regarding the delegation of a quasi-government regulatory authority to SBTI and the conflict of interest concerns inherent in having a single entity act as both standard setter and validator. Fourth, and finally, the impossibility of either the executive or the legislative branches to conduct meaningful oversight of SBTI, a foreign entity which answers to neither. I look forward to a robust discussion on these topics. I'd like to thank everyone for your willingness to be here and to have a dialogue on this important topic. I now recognize Ranking Member Fucci for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Obalnote, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us here today to discuss this proposed rulemaking. As we on the Science Committee know, science-based information is crucial in federal decision-making. The federal government has the responsibility of ensuring that taxpayer money is properly stewarded and improves the lives of all Americans and the functioning of our government. Procurement policy is a significant part of this responsibility. The federal government outlays enormous sums to contractors. Therefore, agencies should gather as much information as possible before selecting companies to receive massive contracts. When it comes to ensuring science-based decision-making in this space, I can think of no more important issue than combating climate change. The proposed rule we are here to discuss has not yet been finalized. The administration is working through public comments, and today we have an opportunity for a productive conversation about how to ensure this rule can best achieve its important goals. In its current form, this rule would offer an unprecedented level of transparency into the greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation strategies of federal contractors, who the government entrusts with hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars. In the private sector, it is well accepted that a company's exposure to climate risk and its contribution to climate change has a direct impact on its bottom line. Shareholders demand to know that they're investing in companies who understand this reality and are working to reduce these risks. Financial institutions increasingly consider their susceptibility to climate-related disasters when making business decisions. Agencies and the Americans who fund them deserve that same level of transparency and forethought. I applaud the Biden administration for taking this step to modernize the federal procurement process. This rulemaking, if finalized, would give agencies the opportunity to make contracting decisions that incorporate an understanding of vulnerability to climate-related risk. This would be a large improvement across the government, but it is especially critical when it comes to ensuring our defense preparedness. Our national security depends on a clear-eyed assessment of the risks posed to our country. The Department of Defense has committed to incorporating climate risks into its strategies. If finalized, this rule will give them crucial information to deliver on that promise. I want to exaggerate the impact of this rule. The FAR Council has chosen to limit its reach to a small subset of contractors. The full suite of requirements would apply only to companies with over $50 million in contract obligations. Just 1.2% of prospective contractors would have any additional reporting requirements at all. And for small businesses and certain nonprofit entities, exemptions are provided to help alleviate the burden of compliance, and agencies can provide waivers for mission-essential purposes. Despite this relatively limited scope, it truly is a significant step forward in promoting contractor transparency for their greenhouse gas emissions. I believe this is also an excellent springboard for further action. I look forward to hearing from our panel about how this rulemaking can be improved before finalization and how we can further bolster our federal infrastructure against the risk of catastrophic climate change. Thank you, Chairman Obalnote. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. We'll move next to our witness panel. Our first witness is Eric Fanning, President and CEO of AIA. Mr. Fanning, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Obalnote and Ranking Member Fucci. Thank you for inviting me to discuss the serious challenges posed by this proposed rule. First, let me begin by emphasizing our industry's deep commitment to sustainability. U.S. aviation manufacturers pledged to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Today, manufacturers are building more efficient planes and more sustainable propulsion. They are also minimizing the impact of the manufacturing process and advancing the use of sustainable aviation fuels. Our companies are working daily to reduce their environmental footprint, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because the market and our customers demand it. We strive to work closely with the federal government to achieve these goals, including supporting appropriate disclosure of climate-related information, including GHG and climate-related financial risks, in accordance with the Executive Order on Climate-Related Financial Risk. But the proposed FAR greenhouse gas emissions rule, while well-intended, is not executable for the American aerospace and defense industry. Under this proposal, federal contractors would be required to disclose emissions and set emission reduction targets based on the standards set by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, an international non-governmental entity. This is applicable to direct and indirect emissions, or Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, which can be challenging enough. However, the greatest challenge comes from disclosing Scope 3 emissions, the emissions created by suppliers and end users, including the emissions generated by aircraft when the airlines or the military fly them. For A&D companies, especially small businesses, accurately assessing Scope 3 emissions is a complex, long-range problem that they do not have the capacity or capability to execute. Furthermore, SBTI does not have sector-based guidance for all industries, including the A&D industry. As such, SBTI may establish aggressive timelines and rigid standards that don't factor in our unique circumstances. For instance, the equipment we produce have much longer service lives than most consumer products. Any science-based target must take this into account, and it's not clear the rule or SBTI would do so. Congress should be particularly concerned about the national security implications of the rule. If the Pentagon provides a total estimate of emissions, will the military then be bound to operate within those parameters regardless of the threats we encounter? Will disclosing this information publicly provide sensitive information, including data about next-generation platforms and use scenarios, to our adversaries? What is even more concerning from a security perspective is that this rule opens the door for foreign influence over U.S. government procurement. SBTI is led by foreign nationals and has no accountability to the U.S. government. The proposed rule taps into other international NGOs to solicit information regarding companies' environmental impacts and targets. If a contractor does not provide this information, or if SBTI does not approve their targets, then the contractor would be ruled ineligible for federal contracts. In other words, it gives a non-governmental international body the authority to determine which American companies can and can't do business with the U.S. government, including our military, all without regard to cost, schedule, and capability of what that company may offer. This rule also places unusually burdensome requirements on small and mid-sized companies that are part of the supply chain, at a time when the Pentagon and the defense community are concerned about the shrinking size of the defense industrial base. Companies, especially these small and mid-sized companies, increasingly cannot afford the costs of doing business with the U.S. government. This rule would become yet another market barrier that could turn companies in the defense industrial base to commercial work instead. A diverse defense industrial base is critical to our military meeting its growing mission set, and this rule would jeopardize that, even as a land war continues in Europe and the threat of conflict in the Indo-Pacific grows. The American A&D industry shares our government's goal of reducing carbon emissions. The proposed rule would place enormous, if even executable, burdens on industry, set up a regulatory-like process without the normal transparency and oversight we have come to expect in the United States, and put our national security at risk by making public, highly sensitive military data. Thank you again for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fanning. Our second witness is Chad Whiteman, Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Whiteman, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Obernolte, Ranking Member Fushi, and members of the committee, subcommittee. I'm Chad Whiteman, Vice President, Environment and Regulatory Affairs for the Global Energy Institute at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for the opportunity to present the U.S. Chamber's views here to the subcommittee on the FAR's climate disclosure rulemaking. Chamber members include federal contractors large and small that provide products and services across diverse industries such as aerospace and defense, telecommunications, information technology, engineering services, food and hospitality, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, energy, and many more. American companies are already playing a crucial role in developing innovations and approaches to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, while also spurring the evolution of climate disclosures. Companies are also increasingly reporting more information to the public about their efforts to reduce their greenhouse gases. Many have also made forward-looking statements and commitments to reduce their emissions over time. While the private sector is making significant progress, regulatory decisions must always be informed by a careful analysis of the available alternatives, outcomes, and cost-benefit trade-offs to ensure that optimal policies are implemented. Such regulatory decisions also must be made within the bounds of agencies' legal authorities. We are concerned that the proposed rule fails to strike the right balance and is an inappropriate and inefficient means of mitigating the potential effects of global climate change. The proposed rule would impose immense costs on government contractors of all sizes, costs that would be passed on to the government and ultimately to taxpayers. This would undermine rather than advance the goal of economic and efficient system of contracting that underpins the Federal Property and Administrative Services Act. Detailed disclosure of climate risk assessment processes and risks, inventorying and disclosing Scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and developing and implementing science-based emissions reduction targets would require thousands of employee hours and saddle contractors with billions of dollars in compliance costs. The government's acquisition costs would rise as a consequence, and some contractors and companies in the supply chain would likely drop out of the market entirely, weakening the competitive forces that keep prices down. The Council's pursuit of goals beyond economic and efficient contracting exceeds its legal authority. While the Council can promulgate specific output-based related standards to help ensure that government acquires the goods and services it needs at appropriate prices, the Council lacks the statutory authority to use government contracts as a vehicle for furthering other policies, like addressing climate change, even if well-intended. The proposal raises significant issues under the Constitution, as it would force contractors to associate with and likely follow the speech guidelines of certain private organizations, whom the Council would deputize to do most of the standard setting and verification. This unusual arrangement would violate contractors' First Amendment rights and would transgress long-standing legal limitations on delegating legislative and rulemaking authority to private entities. The proposed rule would violate the Administrative Procedures Act in several respects. Most significantly, the Council's cost-benefit analysis is flawed and vastly underestimates the costs. For example, the Council alludes to benefits from potential greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but fails to acknowledge or quantify the costs required to achieve such reductions. The actual cost of the Council's proposal would exceed their estimate of $1 billion for the first year and $3 billion over 10 years. The benefits side of the ledger fares no better. The Council also fails to grapple with the duplicative and even conflicting requirements of the Securities and Exchange Commission is simultaneously proposing to impose on public companies. Other aspects of the proposal are equally troubling. The Council fails to account for the disproportionate burden that the proposal imposes on small businesses, both directly as federal contractors and indirectly as suppliers of major contractors. The rule would outsource most of the standard setting to private entities that the federal government does not control, regulate, or monitor. It would undermine national security interests. It would set compliance deadlines that are impossible to meet. It would require contractors to set science-based targets, even if they do not have a viable means of meeting the targets in the short time frame allowed. And it would do all of this without the Council having adequately considered numerous less restrictive alternatives. These and other flaws counsel in favor of abandoning the proposal, as we explained further in our detailed written comments submitted to the Council earlier this year. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Whiteman. Our third witness is Stephen Rothstein, Managing Director of the Ceres Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets. Mr. Rothstein, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Ranking Member, members of the committee. Again, Stephen Rothstein, Managing Director of the Ceres Accelerator, thank you for the invitation to be here. Ceres is a nonprofit organization working with investors and companies to transform the economy and build a just and sustainable future. I'd like to briefly highlight 5 key points in the rule that we're talking about. Number 1, the rule will strengthen the ability of agencies to deliver on their mission while reducing burdens to taxpayers. This rule will make the United States stronger. The federal government spends over $630 billion a year on ranging from food to cement to steel and so much more. It would allow the federal government for the first time to really understand the common business practice of measuring and managing climate risk associated with that. According to a recent Deloitte survey of 2,000 C-suite executives, 97% of those executives say the climate will cause business interruptions in the next few years. PwC did an annual survey of CEOs. 3/4 of those CEOs say that in the next year, the supply chain could be disrupted because of climate risk. Number 2, by focusing on the federal supply chain, the rule addresses a major source of the climate risk. We've all known about the brutal climate events that are happening, but to put it in context, NOAA highlighted that in the 1980s, we had one major, $1 billion or more climate event every 4 months. Every 4 months, the 1980s. 2010s, it was every 3 weeks. This year, it's every 2 weeks. That is costing state and federal taxpayers today hundreds of billions of dollars to prepare and repair for those. So those costs are happening now. One of the fortunate things about the proposed rule is that they only focus on the largest suppliers to ease the burden. And as was said earlier, there is only 1.3% of the federal suppliers that represent 86% of the emission. So that's a way to ensure that. This is not just the U.S. 18 countries have come together and said that they need to reduce emissions, not just for emissions, but to reduce business risk. 18 countries plus the U.S. established the Net Zero Government Alliance. Canada's done something similar, and so many other countries. Number 3, climate risk disclosure is now mainstream among major companies, including many large federal contractors. In fact, 71% of Fortune 500 companies are already disclosing their greenhouse gas emissions. They've done that even without requirements because it makes good business sense. Major federal contractors like General Dynamics, Honeywell, IBM, Johnson Control, and so many more are disclosing their emission reduction targets. Why are they doing this? Because they know it makes sense, and their investors want it. If you look at the rule, the comments that were submitted to the SEC, over 95% of investors, representing over $50 trillion of assets, have said they need this information because it is a business risk. Number 4, this proposed rule is received support broader than, to be honest, I would have thought. We did an analysis of the elements, and looking at the core elements of the rule, not every detail, but it got 19,000 individual supporters and 68 organizational supporters who generally support, including the Council of Defense and Space Industries, BP America, Baker Hughes, Global Electronics, National Workforce and Technology Council, National Contract Management Association, and group like Taxpayers for Common Sense and Sustainable Purchasing Council. Number 5, the proposed rule properly leverages standards that were developed by the private sector, but we do recommend changes from what the FAR Council proposed. Among the steps the proposed rule takes to minimize burdens is to leverage the private sector standards. Leveraging those standards is exactly what Congress sought when it enacted the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act in 1996. But we think to clarify the rule and add flexibility, Ceres recommends the FAR Council not delegate, but set minimum federal standards for science-based targets and allow major contractors to achieve the standards with a widely market-accepted, market-based methodology. That could be SBTI, or if there's another one, let them talk about that too. We also recommend that there should be a third-party process to validate using the same process. In summary, this approach adheres to what we recommend as guiding principle, leveraging the important work that private sector leaders have already undertaken and adhering to best science. Thank you for the opportunity. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rothstein. Our final witness is Victoria Killian, Legislative Attorney for the Congressional Research Services. Ms. Killian, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Obernolte, Ranking Member Foushee, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Victoria Killian, and I'm a legislative attorney at the Congressional Research Service, or as you know as CRS. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today about legal considerations relevant to the proposed rule. My testimony today will focus mainly on two legal areas: the major questions doctrine and the private non-delegation doctrine. If these topics sound vaguely familiar but terribly academic, I completely understand. My objective today is to help explain what these doctrines are, how courts have applied them, and how they might affect the current rulemaking. Both doctrines stem from constitutional principles designed to safeguard Congress's legislative power and are starting to become more prevalent in judicial opinions. The major questions doctrine is about how courts decide whether Congress has authorized an agency to take a particular action. Typically, courts examine the statutory text to see if it provides explicit or implicit authority for a particular agency rulemaking. But there's another consideration as well. The Supreme Court has ruled that when a regulation presents a question of, quote, vast economic and political significance that exceeds the history and breadth of agencies' past assertions of authority, there must be, quote, clear congressional authorization for that action. Essentially, the doctrine creates a higher bar for an agency to show that its regulation falls within the scope of its statutory authority. If the proposed rule were to be finalized as written and challenged in court, a reviewing court might examine the anticipated effects of the rule on various industries in the economy, the compliance costs for federal contractors, and how the promulgating agencies have exercised their authority in the past. If, in the court's view, the rule raised a major question, then the court would likely ask whether a federal statute clearly authorized its requirements. In the proposed rule, the agencies cited federal procurement statutes and executive orders as authorities for the regulation. Accordingly, one question that a reviewing court might consider is whether federal procurement laws clearly authorize the rule's requirements. Turning to the second legal question, private non-delegation, this doctrine provides that Congress may not delegate its legislative authority to unappointed private entities. And likewise, federal agencies generally can't assign their regulatory authority, which comes from Congress, to private entities. Courts have ruled that private organizations can assist federal agencies with implementing federal law so long as they function subordinately to a federal agency and the government has authority and surveillance over their activities. One aspect of the rule that could implicate the private non-delegation doctrine is the requirement that major contractors bidding on a new contract have their emissions targets validated by SBTi, as we've said that as a private entity. If a prospective contractor subject to that requirement does not obtain validation, the proposed rule would create a presumption that the contractor is non-responsible and thus ineligible for the contract. So in evaluating any private non-delegation argument, a reviewing court might consider the nature of SBTi's role. Is it regulatory, or would SBTi perform a ministerial or advisory function? And whether a federal agency adequately supervises its activities. The major questions doctrine and the private non-delegation doctrine are evolving legal areas, and CRS looks forward to helping the subcommittee navigate these legal questions. Thank you for inviting me to testify. I am honored to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Killian. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. I want to just point out the fact that reasonable minds can disagree about the wisdom of implementing a rule like this. And I know a lot of the testimony that we heard this morning was arguments back and forth about whether or not this rule is a good thing. But in my opinion, that's not why we're here. We are here discussing whether or not the administration has the legal authority to impose that rule absent clear authorization from Congress. And I think everyone in this institution should be concerned about that, because if it's not your administration today, it might be your administration tomorrow. We should all be worried about the legislative authority of Congress being usurped by the executive branch. I also am very concerned about the fact that this decision-making authority was delegated apparently to a foreign company with no competitive process involved in its selection. To me, that raises some serious legal and national security issues. And I think that regardless of what your thoughts are and the wisdom of the rule, everyone ought to be concerned about that. Ms. Killian, I enjoyed your testimony about the legalities involved here. I wanted to ask you about the major questions doctrine. You had testified that some of the difficulties when an administration takes actions that don't have clear authorization from Congress. But I'd like your opinion. In this case, does the DOD, the GSA, or NASA have a clear grant of authority to require businesses to disclose and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions?
Thank you for that question, Chairman Obernolte. So under the major questions doctrine, the first consideration would be whether this presents a major question. So your question gets to the second part of the doctrine. If there is a major question, would there be clear congressional authorization? Now, unfortunately, the major questions doctrine is in a state of flux right now, and it is still evolving. So we don't know exactly the parameters of what constitutes clear congressional authorization. How specific does the law have to be? Can the court look at things other than the text of the statute? When it comes to the authorities cited here, the agencies cite 3 statutes, 4 executive orders, and an OMB memorandum as authority for the rule. So there's a lot to unpack, and I'm happy to take specific questions on those.
All right, so is there specific authorization language for those agencies to require the disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions from companies who are involved in procurement?
And unfortunately, Chairman, that is not something that CRS can answer because of the open questions with the major questions doctrine.
Okay, well, I mean, it seemed to me like this is just a factual question about the regulations that have actually been passed, I'm sorry, the legislation that's actually been passed by Congress. Because in combing through them, we can't find any authorization for these agencies to take this action.
So what I can say is the statutes that I've reviewed, which are the ones that the agency is relying on in the authority citations in its proposed rule, do not appear to specifically use the words in this regulation. That said, we don't know how much specificity is required under the Supreme Court's major questions doctrine. So it is a question, I think, of an open legal issue about how to apply that doctrine.
Sure. I know other agencies have been going through this as well in the courts, the EPA in particular.
That's right.
All right. Mr. Whiteman, I wanted to ask about Scope 3 emissions because you brought that up in your testimony. And having been in business for 30 years myself, I was asking myself how on earth I would comply with the requirement to disclose Scope 3 emissions, which, as you said, are not emissions that a procuring company would create, but instead emissions that the suppliers to that company and the end users of that company's products would create. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, for example, what would happen in the case where a supplier refused to disclose its own emissions to someone who was bidding on a federal procurement contract?
It's a really good question. It's an important point to bring up. Scope 3 emissions are quite challenging to estimate. And I think in this rulemaking, what is even more concerning is if you're able to identify the Scope 3 emissions, then you have to go out and actually reduce your emissions. You set the targets, and then you have to actually reduce them. So you have to not only reduce them at your company level, but you have to get your suppliers all through the supply chain to make commitments to do the same. And I think that's one of the unaccounted for impacts of the rulemaking. It doesn't just affect the 6,000 or so estimated contractors. It affects a much broader number all the way down through the supply chain. And the council didn't adequately analyze that.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you very much. I can see I'm out of time. Hopefully we'll have time for another round of questions. I now yield to the ranking member, Ms. Fucci, for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rothstein, this rule will provide unprecedented insight into the climate risks contained without the federal procurement sector. As you said in your testimony, the federal government is the world's largest purchaser of products and services. Therefore, the government has a weighted responsibility to ensure American taxpayer money is stewarded responsibly. How will the proposed rule, if finalized, help the government make informed decisions to protect taxpayer dollars from climate-related risks? And further, are agencies required to take any action based on the information disclosed to them pursuant to this rule if finalized? I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter serious public comment into the record.
Without objection.
In those comments and in your testimony, you mentioned the enormous amount of money the federal government spends as the world's largest purchaser of goods and services. That's an incredible opportunity to move the ball forward on crucial priorities like climate change. Can you please elaborate on how this rule and thoughtful procurement policy in general can move the market at large?
Thank you very much. I'm going to date myself, but in the 80s, I worked on a project looking at the federal government exploring the idea of recycled paper, and that moved the marketplace at the time. Clearly, climate change is an enormous risk right now, but it's really a financial risk. If you look at it, as I say, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars. NOAA projects that last year, our country, if you just look at the storms, $1 billion and above, is $160 billion in direct costs. That doesn't count healthcare costs and other costs for our country. So for the first question is, what are the costs today? The costs are enormous, and they're growing exponentially. The one thing that the scientists have taught us over the last decades, if anything, their estimates have been underreported in terms of what those costs have been. So, and there isn't any other issue that we wouldn't want a business leader or government official to have good information about. So we think this is critical. The second question you asked about in terms of what would be requirements, that's really up to the senior people. There is no requirement for a procurement officer to take certain action except for just kind of filling out the box, and it's up to the senior people in the agency to make a determination, as it should be. And we would want someone who's material. For example, if the Department of Defense is relying on contractors that are using, let's say, Panama Canal or Mississippi River, and there's droughts, and those ships are delayed, that can affect national defense. In fact, the Defense Department has stated that one of the national issues from security perspective is climate. So we think this would help taxpayers reduce climate risk, reduce healthcare costs, as well as improve national security without putting burdens. And just to highlight, this is only for the largest of suppliers. 1.3% have to disclose, but in terms of their emission reductions, that's less than 1%. So it's a small handful of the federal suppliers.
Some criticism of this rule has alleged that requiring information on climate risk from prospective contractors will undermine the government's ability to make national defense the priority. What is your response to that?
First, just the opposite. Again, if you look back what the Department of Defense has said, that having more information is important. It's also that there are thousands of companies that will have to release this anyway under European rules. There's a new law that was just passed in California that includes Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. That's not just California companies, but it's companies operating across the country, both public and private, so that this information is out there. And again, 92% of Fortune 500 companies today publicly release some climate information. They do that because they understand that they want it, their investors want it, their employees want it. It makes the companies more secure and our government more secure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. We'll go down to Congressman McCormick. Sir, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. By the way, Mr. Chair, I appreciate you talking about the legal authority between the executive and the legislative branches of who gets to delegate what authority there is to begin with. That's what's really concerning with me. As a matter of fact, in the last couple of years, what we've seen is the legislative branch being overrun by the executive branch being able to tell us where we invest our IRA savings, where the DOD gets to advertise, whether we have some modifications on our weapons. I think it's interesting when we talk about this. I realize that there's an alarming overreach by the executive branch that's unchecked and unconstitutional. As a matter of fact, I would say that maybe the new moniker should be King Joe, based on the way he's acting without any authorization from a balanced government system that we designed by our Constitution. For those of you who want to talk science, I heard what you guys had to say, somebody talking about global warming. Let's talk to science for a second. I'm a scientist, MD, MBA. I've done some classes, probably just like you guys. One of the things that I don't understand when it comes to carbon emissions, because that's what we're talking about, right? We're not producing methane. Now, animals are and and land waste and stuff like that. But we're going to talk about carbon emissions. What is the atmosphere made of, primarily? Overwhelmingly, nitrogen, right? Then oxygen. What's the percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Anybody want to answer that? Nobody wants to answer that. Scientifically, it's an easy question. 5 minutes on Google. 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen. Carbon dioxide is 0.04%. Of that, what percentage comes from man-made? Of that 0.04, anybody want to answer that? Google will tell you. It's around 11%. So 11% of 0.04% is produced by man-made, but that's what we're focused all of our attention on. That's what's caused global warming. That retention by that 0.04% of the carbon emissions that we are 11% of is what we're debating here. The hundreds of billions of dollars we want to put in to prevent that, and that's going to prevent global warming and cooling, because we're talking about environmental change, which could be either. And over the millennium, I just recently watched say that it's the hottest month in 100,000 years, based on one scientific evidence. What reporting did we have around the world 100,000 years ago? I didn't see that Egyptian hieroglyphic. Did you? No answers. When I ask scientists all the time, no answers on how we are producing this climate change. I'm not saying there's not climate change. I'm not saying there's not scientific things we can do to keep a clean environment. I'm the son of a forest ranger. I believe in a clean environment. I will be the first one to pick up trash in the street when I walk by it. But let's not get carried away and limit our ability to get things done, to keep our global leadership instead of globalism. Mr. Fanning, you made a great point. A foreign entity who gets to tell the United States what's going on based on an executive order. Do you consider that globalism?
I don't know that I would try to label it globalism or something else. I'm just concerned that it puts other nations in the decision process and what our Pentagon should buy to defend the country.
I couldn't agree with you more. As a matter of fact, if you're going to be King Joe, I don't know why you'd put the power back in somebody else's opinion. Now, you talk about Mr. Rothenstein, other people in the world having the same criteria. When we put ourselves on par with everybody else, are we putting ourselves in jeopardy of actually being reined in by other countries?
Congressman, first, thank you for your public service and for your question. We're not on par. We're the greatest country in the world.
Amen. We agree on
And
that.
that I believe is actually patriotic to think about our taxpayers, think about our national defense, to think about our climate, which scientists agree across the board that. And
Okay, let me interrupt you there, please. Scientists agree across the board. I debate that science because I read scientists from both sides, just like I do on economic policy. Not everybody believes in modern monetary theory. Not all scientists believe that we are the cause of global warming. Now, we like to pretend like that's the case, and King Joe likes to say that we have scientists in universal agreement. That's simply not true. I'm out of time, but I want to make a point that we have silenced people who dissent from King Joe, and I think that's a big problem today, and we need to address that first. Thank you. With that, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. We'll hear next from Mr. Caston. And Congressman, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I am really troubled that we are debating science on the Science Committee. I was a molecular biology major. I would no more claim to be a doctor than a doctor should claim to be a climate scientist. Do better. 50% of all the CO2 we have ever emitted as a species is since I graduated from college in 1993. And we're going to sit here denying? My God! Let's move on to some more serious conversations. Mr. Rothstein, if I understand right, that a lot of companies are voluntarily reporting their climate disclosures, and there is no consistent standard that they currently use to do that, correct?
Correct.
Yes, okay. Mr. Whiteman, a number of my Republican colleagues are talking about putting a carbon border adjustment tax in order to protect U.S. steel manufacturing because U.S. steel has less carbon impact than Chinese steel. Do you agree that U.S. steel is cleaner than Chinese steel?
I'm not sure I know enough to opine on that, but
Well, let me give you another question. The U.S. gas industry often says that we should increase U.S. gas exports because it's cleaner than the fuels we displace around the world. Do you agree with that statement?
industry is some of the cleanest industry in the world here in the U.S.
Okay, how do you
Huge amount of
possibly
gas.
know that if we don't have consistent climate reporting? That's my point, right? Like, we can talk a good game, but everybody's reporting wildly different things because we don't have consistent standards. Mr. Rothstein, is a U.S. multinational that does business in Europe subject to European climate disclosure rules?
Yes, thousands of them.
Okay. Does anybody on the panel think that it is in the interest of the United States not to lead? Now, I ask that question because I was in Madrid at the climate conference after the prior president pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord. We were the only country in the world that had decided not to be a part of that treaty. And I got pulled aside by some of our European colleagues who said, can you please take this back to your country and let them know that we have direct experience here in Europe that really bad things happen when the United States chooses not to lead. The question sitting before us here is not some completely fabricated major questions doctrine. And let's be really clear. This is not something with any robust legal precedent. This is a question of, do we think that we in the legislative branch are going to completely cede our authority to the judicial branch to decide what we meant? If anybody on the other side of the street has a question about what Congress meant, they should give us a call and we can tell them. But all of us know it is insane for us to specify every little detail we want in a proposal. We give the executive branch legal authority to expand on these things, and if we're not going to push back, we are basically saying that this Article 1 branch is less worthy of our co-equal powers than the judicial branch is. The unelected judicial branch, I might add. So to sit here and say, do we think that the United States government has the legal authority to lead? Do we think that the United States government has the legal authority to collect data necessary to make decisions? Do we believe that the United States government has the legal authority to actually follow the laws of physics and assume that they are immutable, even if you couldn't get a vote on the floor today that agrees that the laws of thermodynamics are entirely non-negotiable? And we're going to argue that that's because of a major questions doctrine? That is insanity. With due respect to my friends on the other side of the aisle, what the hell are we talking about here? Get the data. Disclose the data. There's $8.4 trillion of investors who want to invest in ESG funds, who want clear disclosure rules. There's massive amounts of capital that are flowing into cleaner energy, giving us access to cheaper energy. If we want to win the future, if we want to own the technologies, my God, get the hell out of the way. I yield back.
Okay. Gentleman yields back. We'll hear next from Congresswoman Tenney. Congresswoman, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Fushi, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to insert into the record science-based target SBTI's Articles of Incorporation, a document from We Mean Business, in quotes, stating that they are a project of the New Venture Fund, and the Who We Are page from New Venture Fund, which states that they are managed by Arabella Advisors.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While my colleagues have focused on many highly concerning aspects of the Biden administration's proposed rulemaking requiring companies to contract with SBTI, I want to focus on the motivation for this decision. Why is the Biden administration forcing companies to use only SBTI as opposed to any other climate group? The answer is surprisingly simple. This is a left-wing dark money patronage scheme. Let's put aside the fact that SBTI is registered in the United Kingdom and was only formed on June 26, 2023, 8 months after this proposed rule was issued. SBTI's Certificate of Incorporation as a private limited company states that their largest owner is the We Mean Business Coalition, Inc., which is under the Arabella Advisors umbrella. Who is the We Mean Business Coalition, according to documents from We Mean Business? They are simply a project of the New Venture Fund, again, going back to Arabella Advisors. And according to the website, it is solely, wholly owned by Arabella Advisors. And for those unfamiliar with who Arabella Advisors is, Influence Watch describes them as, and I quote, philanthropic consulting company that guides the strategy, advocacy, impact investing, and management for high-dollar, left-leaning nonprofits and individuals, close quote. The financial supporters and donors of Arabella Advisors and its subsidiaries include George Soros, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Michael Bloomberg, and the American Federation of Teachers, just to name a few, although we don't know who the rest are because it's a dark money fund. Simply put, Arabella Advisors uses the New Venture Fund, along with the Windward Fund, the 1630 Fund, the Hopewell Fund, and the North Fund to funnel money to Democrats and left-wing causes. Through these funds, Arabella Advisors finances other ventures such as the Demand Justice Initiative, the Demand Progress Education Fund, Fix the Court, Redistricting Reform Project, and the Climate and Clean Energy Equity Fund. These radical groups advocate for everything from expanding the Supreme Court, partisan gerrymandering, defunding our military, abortion on demand, and much more. How does this web of dark money go? Ceres, which Mr. Stephen Rothstein, one of the witnesses here, represents, received $3.3 million from the New Venture Fund and is an original founder and part of the We Mean Business Coalition, which owns SBTI. This hearing is not about the existence of dark money. It's about the Biden administration's new unconstitutional proposed rule forcing companies to contract with a subsidiary of Biden's donors' left-wing money group. The forced contracting will undoubtedly provide substantial profits for SBTI, creating new capital which can be moved through this dark money web to fund left-wing priorities and other left-wing politicians. This is a network of corruption which undermines the trust that the taxpayers put in us. And while I appreciate the witnesses for being here, the only one who can ultimately give us answers we need is the Council on Environmental Quality Chair, Brenda Mallory. While I understand that this committee invited Chair Mallory to testify, she unfortunately declined, which is simply unacceptable. The American people deserve the answers, and I urge this committee to subpoena Chair Mallory for another hearing on this matter. We must get to the bottom of this. I do have one question with the little bit of time that I have left. I'd like to direct this to Ms. Killian, as I laid out the direct link between SBTI and Arabella Advisors, which means SBTI can be used to line the pockets of Democratic donors and left-wing dark money groups. Under this precedent, if this rule to become finalized, under the precedent established by this administration with this rule, you wouldn't object to a Republican administration amending a proposed rule to mandate that validation services be provided by companies primarily tied to the GOP donors, would you?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for that question. I want to make sure I understood your question. It is as to the issue of delegating authority to SBTI.
Well, let me ask you, would you, if this were the Republicans asking for a proposed rule to use a dark money donor to the Republican side, would you approve of that rule?
Well, I think as an attorney for the Congressional Research...
Well, yes, sir. Was that a yes, sir? You would approve of it?
Oh, I didn't say yes or no. I think that's the information that I can't
If you're an attorney,
verify.
I'm an attorney as
outside
well.
of
Can you
my-
just give me your opinion on it as an attorney? Would this be something that would be good for the taxpayers to use a dark money
Well,
subgroup to fund
Here's what I can
organizations?
say, because I want to be careful
Yeah.
because I don't have any of the information that you're talking about. I wasn't prepared on that for this testimony. But here's what I can say about the legal aspect of that. One of the considerations in the private non-delegation doctrine is a question of whether the government is delegating regulatory authority to a competitor in an industry.
Well, let me stop you on that because I'm going to reclaim my time. I'm out of time. Do you think it's fair that we allow that to happen, that we only have one entity that the government goes to confirm these contracts and not a choice?
That is a policy question that I can't opine on as an attorney for CRS.
I'm afraid my time's expired. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
The gentleman yields back. We'll hear next from Congressman Babin. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you, witnesses, for being here. Appreciate it. Ranking Member Fushi and Mr. Chairman, thank you. I have a series of questions for you, Mr. Whiteman, if you don't mind. On this rule, I would ask, how is this rule different from the SEC's climate disclosure rule?
Well, the SEC's climate disclosure rule is set up to protect investors, whereas this rulemaking is set up to disclose emissions and ultimately to try to reduce those emissions. So it's a much different scheme. One is about public disclosure, and this one is, the FAR rule is about public disclosure, but going further and actually requiring emissions reductions.
Okay, is there any concern in the business community of having to comply with several different greenhouse gas reporting standards? And as an example, SEC, FAR, and EPA.
That's a really good question, and I think there are a lot of concerns with that. One, the concern of the cost of redundant, conflicting reporting requirements. I think there are issues with the public trying to understand which are the actual valid real emissions or emissions reductions. And this eventually flows into issues of litigation where companies could be sued under False Claims Acts for actually saying they're going to reduce their emissions, but a third party is accusing them of not actually doing what they said. If you have 3 different standards, it makes it much more difficult for companies to show, okay, here's actually what my emissions are, and what I said I've done is actually true.
Gotcha. Are the compliance deadlines that are set within this rule, in your opinion, reasonable and achievable?
I don't think they are. For the first part, do you want me to elaborate? The first part of the disclosure part is disclosing Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. They're required to be done within 1 year of finalizing the rulemaking. The problem is you have to account for 12 continuous months of emissions reporting to actually be able to report that. So literally day one that the rulemaking is finalized, you would actually have to start recording your emissions and registering them, which is an impossible task, not knowing what is actually in the final rulemaking.
Okay, thank you. And then a question for Mr. Fanning, if you don't mind. Certain businesses, such as those in space and aviation, require extensive use of fossil fuels. What are some of the challenges that those businesses will face in setting emission reduction targets and then having to comply with them?
I think the issue for aerospace and defense, sort of riffing on what my seatmate here had to say, is not knowing what the requirements are going to be, not understanding what this organization, SBTI, is thinking in terms of aerospace and defense, is thinking in terms of sector guidance, is thinking in terms of how they're going to define what it is they want you to report and how to set these goals and then how to achieve these goals. Most of the companies in aerospace and defense are already trying to do that right now because of market demand. And in fact, all of the major companies in aerospace and defense, as defined by the rule, $50 million or more in government contracts, are disclosing some financial climate risk already. For us, the bigger issue with this rule is Scope 3. It does sweep up the industrial base, the supply chain. The big defense companies have thousands of companies in their supply chain, and so it would go far beyond the number of companies defined in the analysis of the rule, and require us to understand how the end user is going to use the product, which is most of what falls into Scope 3 when you're in an industry that's building things that are meant to last for 30 years.
Okay, one more. I would ask Mr. Whiteman again. What is the business community's perspective on the use of these private entities to develop, revise, and enforce the provisions of the rule? I mean, I know where you're going with it, but just for the record.
There's a lot of concerns. I think one of the main concerns is that these third parties could change the standards at any time. They could do it outside of the notice and comment process, which is established under the Administrative Procedures Act, which allows the opportunity for the public to take a look at the proposal, evaluate it, and provide comment, and requires the regulatory agency to then respond to those comments. So there's accountability, there's transparency issues that are built in there, and that's not built into this regulation if you're relying upon third parties.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and I'm out of time, so I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll hear next from Congressman Miller. Sir, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you to the chair, and thank you to the ranking member and all the witnesses who are with us here today. Thank you for your time and patience. Mr. Whiteman, my first question is for you. Do you think that this rule will reduce the participation of small businesses in diversity in federal contracting and inhibit innovation?
I think it will. I think because of the costs, I think because of the complexity of the rulemaking, the timing of compliance, I think it's just going to put downward pressure on the participation of small businesses who proportionally are going to have much higher costs than bigger businesses to comply with something like this rulemaking.
And thank you for that answer. Second question for you, Mr. Whiteman. Are there any outside factors that you believe may make it more difficult for companies to comply with these standards?
Yeah, certainly outside factors. I think there are many factors that make it difficult for folks to comply. Certainly the third-party standards make it challenging. Again, getting back to what I said to Representative Babin, if you're looking at third parties changing the standards constantly, how are you going to know what your standards are going to be in the future? I think there's a lot of litigation potential under the False Claims Act, and not knowing where these public policies are going to go. Some of the changes recently at the SBTI have been significant, reducing the period of time to set targets just due to outside global policy reports that are driving their target setting.
Thank you for that answer. Mr. Rothstein, my next question is for you. Do you see any conflict of interest with SBTI being incorporated in a foreign country and being able to set costly regulatory standards that may favor foreign investors or nations, some of whom may not be friendly? And I believe we've seen some of that, but...
First, thank you again for your public service, Congressman. Appreciate it. Ceres believes that the FAR Council should adopt their own rule. They should look at what's in the private sector, including SBTI, but not delegate it specifically to SBTI. But it's important to use market-based and science-based approach, and if there's something else out there, to look at that too.
Thank you. How can companies, and this is for you as well, sir, how can companies meaningfully engage in the standard-setting process if third parties can set or revise standards without going through a public notice and comment process that is normally required for federal regulations?
Again, we believe that the FAR Council should set regulations, utilize the best practices as the act I talked about earlier from 1996 has looked for, and just to highlight that this would only be covering for the largest companies, and then for them, they're largest in the supply chain. So we talked about Scope 3 earlier. It is not every company in the supply chain. It's really the largest ones that have the most material impact. The others can be used for averages, that there are thousands of companies around the world using this now, and so they found that it is a practical way to work.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, this is all the questions that I have, and I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. We'll hear next from Congressman Keene. Sir, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Either Mr. Fanning or Mr. Whiteman, there is clear evidence that Russia has in the past funneled millions of dollars through non-governmental organizations to influence U.S. energy markets. Are there concerns among your membership that SBTI is susceptible to such influence from Russia or other countries or other entities?
I can take that question. Thank you. I think there is some concern there in that SBTI does take funding from outside parties, and certainly with the U.S. exporting larger volumes of LNG to Europe to support our allies, you could see that certain countries, Russia, may have an incentive to influence that process to impose higher costs on the oil and gas industry here in the U.S. to create a competitive advantage.
Ms. Killian, given this the requirement of a clear grant of statutory authority and vast economic and political significance under the Major Questions Doctrine, does the collaboration with CEQ change the authority of DOD, GSA, and NASA are required to maintain in order to promulgate this regulation?
Thank you for that question, Congressman Keene. My understanding of CEQ's role here is that, and this is just based on the executive orders, detailing CEQ's involvement here. So Executive Order 14030, for example, requires consultation with the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality. So in a consultative role, I don't think that CEQ's involvement would affect the authority for the rule, which is not promulgated by CEQ. The rule is promulgated by the FAR Council, the DOD, GSA, and NASA.
Okay. Mr. Fanning, do your members have concerns as it pertains to both meeting the Scope 3 requirements outlined in the proposed rule, as well as safeguarding sensitive information against foreign actors?
Thank you. Yes, we do. The difference in this rule from what's taking place already is the addition of the Scope 3 reporting requirements. For an industry like aerospace and defense, again, that builds platforms that last decades and has a global supply chain and a global market, being able to get accurate information to aggregate, to roll into their report seems unexecutable. But when you add in the national security component, because if you're talking about federal contractors in aerospace and defense, the Department of Defense is the biggest customer. We're not even sure they would offer that information, nor would we want them to for national security reasons. Because part of the rule, if you read through all of it and carry it out, is that this information is meant then to be transparent and shared publicly, so all of our adversaries would have access to it as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. That concludes our questioning. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here and for your valuable testimony today, and all of our members for their questions. It's been an interesting and very emotional topic, and I hope we have a further discussion on this. The record will remain open for 10 days for additional comments and written questions from our members. This hearing is adjourned.